The Cold War was not a traditional war with tanks rolling across borders or armies clashing on battlefields every day. It was something far more complex, a clash of ideas, systems, and superpowers that lasted for nearly half a century. At its heart, the Cold War was a struggle between two powerful nations that emerged as global giants after World War II, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The United States represented capitalism, democracy, and free market economies. It positioned itself as the defender of liberty, individual rights, and open societies. The Soviet Union represented communism, one-party rule, and a state-controlled economy. It claimed to fight for equality, collective ownership, and a world free from capitalist exploitation. These two ideologies were fundamentally opposed, and after World War II, both powers sought to expand their influence across the globe. The United States wanted to prevent the spread of communism, fearing that it would undermine democracy and economic freedom. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, wanted to spread communism and build a world aligned with its values, seeing capitalism as a system of oppression and inequality. Although both had fought side by side against Nazi Germany, their alliance was temporary, built only on the necessity of defeating Hitler. Once the war ended in 1945, old tensions resurfaced, and the competition for global influence began almost immediately. The Cold War did not mean constant fighting. Instead, it was a war fought with propaganda, espionage, economic aid, proxy wars, nuclear threats, and political maneuvering. At times, it came dangerously close to becoming a hot war, but direct large-scale fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union never broke out. The earliest sign of the Cold War appeared in Europe, as the continent lay in ruins after World War II. The United States pushed the Marshall Plan, offering billions of dollars in economic aid to rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, in contrast, tightened its control over Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments in countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. This division of Europe gave birth to the Iron Curtain, a symbolic and physical barrier separating the capitalist West from the communist East. Berlin became the first major flashpoint. The city was divided into East and West, with the Soviets controlling the East and the Americans, British and French, controlling the West. In 1948, the Soviet Union tried to cut off West Berlin by blocking all road and rail access, hoping to force the Allies out. The United States and its allies responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year, until the Soviets backed down. This was one of the first clear victories for the United States in the Cold War, but it also showed that this struggle would be long and tense. In 1949, the United States formed NATO, a military alliance with Western European nations to resist Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern European communist states together under its leadership. That same year, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons and escalating the arms race. Both nations soon raced to build larger, more destructive weapons. Hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear submarines became terrifying symbols of power. The world now lived under the constant shadow of nuclear war, a balance of terror known as mutually assured destruction. While Europe was the center stage, the Cold War quickly spread across the globe, turning many nations into battlegrounds for influence. In Asia, the Korean War became the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. The Communist North, backed by the Soviet Union and China, fought against the capitalist South, supported by the United States and the United Nations. The war ended in stalemate, with the Korean Peninsula divided along the 38th parallel, a division that still exists today. The United States also became involved in Vietnam, attempting to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This conflict would grow into a full-scale war in the 1960s, becoming one of the most controversial chapters in American history. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union extended its influence into parts of Africa and the Middle East, supporting revolutionary movements and socialist governments. The competition was not only military or political, it also extended into science, culture, and technology. The space race became one of the most visible aspects of the Cold War rivalry. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This achievement terrified the United States, which feared Soviet dominance in space could translate into military superiority. In response, America poured resources into space exploration, leading to the creation of NASA and an educational push in science and technology. The race culminated in 1969 when the United States successfully landed astronauts on the moon, a moment that demonstrated American technological supremacy. But even as humans looked to the stars, the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed over the Earth. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. When American reconnaissance discovered the missiles, President John F. Kennedy confronted Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath as U.S. naval ships blockaded Cuba, and both sides prepared for possible war. Finally, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and a secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis revealed how dangerous the Cold War had become, and it pushed both sides to establish direct communication lines to prevent future catastrophes. Despite such close calls, the Cold War continued through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, shaping global politics in every corner of the world. Espionage became a defining feature of the rivalry. Agencies like the CIA and the KGB carried out covert operations, recruited spies, and waged a shadow war of secrets and deception. Cultural influence also played a major role. Hollywood films, American music, and consumer products became symbols of freedom and modernity. In contrast, the Soviet Union promoted socialist art, literature, and propaganda that glorified workers, the state, and collective struggle. The competition was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about controlling land or armies. By the 1970s, the Cold War entered a phase known as Détente, where both sides sought to ease tensions. Agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, placed some limits on nuclear weapons, and trade between East and West expanded slightly. But détente did not last forever. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited tensions, leading the United States to boycott the Moscow Olympics and escalate its military spending. Under President Ronald Reagan, the U.S. adopted a hardline stance, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and investing heavily in new weapon systems, including the Strategic Defense Initiative. The pressure on the Soviet economy grew immense. Its rigid central planning system struggled to keep up with America's technological and financial strength. At the same time, discontent spread within Eastern Europe. People longed for freedom, prosperity, and the rights they saw in the West. In the 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms called glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. These policies aimed to modernize the Soviet Union, but they also unleashed forces that the government could not control. Eastern European nations began breaking free from Soviet control. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, was torn down. The Cold War effectively ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. The conflict had lasted nearly half a century, reshaping politics, technology, and international relations forever. The Cold War was not only about nuclear missiles, spies, or space exploration. It was about how two very different visions of the world competed for dominance. The United States promoted individual freedom, markets, and democracy, though not without contradictions and flaws. The Soviet Union pushed for equality, state control, and socialism, though in practice it often brought authoritarianism and repression. For ordinary people, the Cold War meant living under constant uncertainty. Children practiced nuclear drills at school. Citizens feared spies and betrayal. Families were divided by borders and walls. Yet, it also drove scientific progress, international cooperation, and eventually, a recognition of the need to avoid nuclear catastrophe. Today, the Cold War remains a defining chapter of the 20th century, shaping the world we live in even decades later. Its legacy lives on in international alliances, unresolved regional conflicts, and the nuclear arsenals that still exist. It also left lessons about the dangers of unchecked rivalry, the importance of diplomacy, and the resilience of people seeking freedom. The Cold War was not just a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a struggle that touched every continent, influenced millions of lives, and changed the course of history. When we look back at it simply, we see not just a story of conflict, but a reminder of how fragile peace can be and how important it is to learn from the past.